an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, here we are. Look at that. Back in the saddle. Good to be here. Dave Trafford. It's Now and Next. And it's a busy week. Thanks for hanging in. Indeed. This is Now and Next from Story Studio Network. And if you're just new to the program, yeah, we kind of talk about some of the stories, issues, ideas, events that affect you, your kids, your mom and dad, your brothers and sisters, your work colleagues, your business, just stuff that's going on in the world that aren't necessarily going to be, about car accidents and brawls on Main Street. That's not what we do here. We want to get into some of the issues of the day. So, quite frankly, we took a bit of a respite and had the opportunity to celebrate my wife's retirement. And we were off. It's something she wanted to do for a long time. We spent a month in Europe and a couple of weeks in France, a couple of weeks in Italy. It crescendoed with a week at a villa in Tuscany, beautiful countryside. And we did it with 4 other couples, friends we've had for a long time. One guy I've known since 1968. Yeah, so not only have Tom and I survived our friendship since 1968, more important, we all survived a week together in Italy, and we left parted ways, still friends, and we're anxious to take a look at the photos and the memories and so on. So, and the nice thing is we got to extend our summer, so because it was hot, it was beautiful weather, so on. It's just, great time away, food, friends, some beverages were involved. It's good. And we're glad to be back. And man, did a lot of shit happen while I was away. We're going to talk more about it this week, about our Echo Community Podcast Network. We launched it in North Bay on the 14th of September. So 2 weeks ago, we hit go, and off we went. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But it's basically a local media podcast network. And it's fun. So I'll put the details in the show notes so you don't have to go fumbling around. But if you want to check it out, the details, the link to the site and the podcast will be in our show notes. All right. And it's focused and it's located in North Bay. And the idea is, and it came up about 10 months ago, that folks in North Bay reached out to us and specifically to Aaron, because Aaron had a startup job in North Bay. She was the first co-host team in the morning on the Moose when it was launched. I want to say back in 2007, something like that, 6 or 7, a while ago. And boom, man, they came out of the box hot, right to number 1 in North Bay. And so she had a pretty good sense of what the market was like, and the folks in the market had a pretty good sense of what Aaron was like. So there were some players there who thought, our local media, how shall I say this, sucks. It does not represent what goes on in North Bay. And given everything else that's going on in this country lately, you'll know that North Bay is not alone. So we started into the conversation of what could we do. And Scott Clark at Clark Communications and Aaron engaged in the conversation. We brought our teams together. And we came up with a pretty neat little package. And, it's a work in progress. But essentially it relies on one original podcast that is produced twice a week, and it's about North Bay. And there's a newsletter that goes with it. And it's specifically more newsy than the podcast, but the podcast is about events and culture and people and, the kind of cool things in the community. All the things that you're not going to get by watching the local CTV newscast out of Northern Ontario or Central Ontario. CBC can't handle it. The papers don't really give a rat's rectum. They've got 2 people maybe working the whole region. So anyway, it's been a fun project so far. We're only 2 weeks in. So we're going to have Aaron and Scott on tomorrow, and we'll talk about that and the state of local media. And it just so happened 2 days after we made the announcement, we heard from Metroland and Metro Media, both of the, companies that control so much of the community newspapers in Quebec and Ontario, at least. They're packing it in. So a lot of these small communities now have no voice. None. Yeah, they might have a radio station that's, being piped in from Toronto. Great. But no real voice. So that's the whole point of this community podcast network. It's called Echo, because we want your voice to be heard. We hear you. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then on Thursday, we're going to introduce you to the editorial brains behind the network out of North Bay. And that'll be fun. And they're characters, both characters, but they get it. And they've already made a splash in that community. So we're quite anxious to introduce you to Lisa and Dave, and they'll be able to kind of walk you through what it is and the kind of reaction they're getting. Because local news matters. Local media matters. And local news doesn't have to be, as I said, an accident at the corner of 1 and 2 or a fight on downtown Main Street. That's not what that's okay. Yeah, I suppose. The news is, how is our community thriving? The news is, how are we making sure that the stop sign that we need at the corner of 1 and 2 is there because people are getting run over? It's not that there's an accident. It's the accountability and how do we make sure our community is safe and livable. All of those things. Those are the things that we're looking at, right? So we'll talk about that. And then Friday, the On the Ledge team is all ready to go. Yeah, that's your Ontario Politics podcast. I've been away for a month, but it seems like there might be stuff to talk about after a quiet, lazy... Okay, I know it wasn't. Holy crap. I mean, can you imagine that was a quiet summer for Doug Ford? And, of course, it was no better in Ottawa for the feds. So the whole idea that, things kind of chill out, MPs, MPPs all go back to their, constituencies, talk to the voters, and, maybe it could be, but who knows? The idea that all they got was grief, and grief of their own making for both governments, right? So anyway, lots to talk about, and I am going to connect here presently with David Coletto. If you're a close listener, you'll know David. He is the CEO and the chair and a co-founder at Abacus Data. He's been doing some polling for the Toronto Star for the last little while, but he's always got his finger on the pulse of what's going on. So I want to get his take on the Greenbelt, what's going on with the feds as far as the horse race is concerned, and some of the language that we use around politics now. I'm not sure there's such a thing as a party line anymore. I think, and David will correct me, but I think now our political engagement is based more on political issues. And I don't mean politics, big P, small p, and that is stuff that affects you, right? Issue by issue, rather than a platform for a particular party. And David Coletto is on the way. right, as promised, lots to talk about. And yeah, holy cow. I feel like I'm just kind of putting the air back in the tires here and getting everything tuned up and back on the road. It's good to have David Coletto here from Abacus Data. And, while we were away, David, I'm thinking, okay, that's the end of it. Fill in the blank, whatever story might have come up. We had the Greenbelt. We had the federal government accusing India of being involved in the assassination of a Canadian citizen. Now we've still got the lingering story around the Speaker of the House in Ottawa, honoring a Nazi sympathizer. I mean, there's no way to talk your way out of that one. So I'm guessing, and even before I left, you guys were still doing research on what does the horse race look like in Ottawa. And even since then, in the last 5 weeks, month or so, those numbers are really interesting to see the way they shift. And maybe we can start there, because I think the last time we chatted was you were starting to see where the Conservatives were being favored by the younger voter, particularly, the Gen Z group and millennials to some degree, which was pretty much, they're cutting the Liberals' grass significantly. And then you begin to look regionally, and it's beyond a tight race in some cases where the Conservatives have a significant edge. So a lot of things that we wouldn't have been saying even at the end of June.
Yeah, no, the environment has completely changed. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is we had seen for about a year a number of indicators, as we would say in the polling business, turning against the Liberals, right? For a year now, the Prime Minister's negatives have been rising pretty, slowly but steadily. People's the approval rating of the government, the negatives are up over that course of the year. And we had seen a real steady decline in confidence in the country, more people saying the country's headed in the wrong direction. But what's happened in the last, 3 months is all of that, I think, has come together at the same time that Pierre Poilievre is out there with ads talking directly to Canadians. And we now, this session of Parliament starts with not just our poll, but many other polls showing the Conservatives with a double-digit lead nationally, showing them winning in Atlantic Canada, winning substantially in British Columbia, winning by 9 points in Ontario. And as you said, probably the most shocking shift is young Canadians saying they are much more likely to say they'd vote Conservative today than the Liberals. And the Liberals are in third place among those two groups. And those younger voters were instrumental in first giving Justin Trudeau a majority in 2015 and then re-electing him in the next two elections. And so the Liberals in Ottawa are facing an environment they have not faced since they were elected in 2015, one in which I think people have lost faith and trust in the Prime Minister, which means they're not listening to him all that much, and a skepticism about whether this government can actually get a handle on all the issues that they think are important, which are the cost of living, housing, and to some extent the healthcare system, but that's much more provincially focused.
And you will know better than anybody that we do not historically vote in a new government. We vote out an old government. So that's the case. But it was interesting, I think, and I saw it in your newsletter last couple of days, and you were talking about the new character or quality of the voters, if you will, in terms of what's shaping our politics. And I recall this is maybe even 10 years ago, we started to talk about people voting not along party lines, but along issues. And so where you might have had these verticals where this was the Liberal and the NDP and the Conservative vertical. Now we've kind of turned that on its side a little bit, and we've got the environment, we've got housing, we've got social justice, we've got, climate change all by itself, aside from the environment, healthcare, education, that in fact, these are the principles that are driving political action or activity or engagement. And I thought it was interesting. You had this sort of view of it, and you read it. Was it the Financial Times? So, and the idea being that, there's a certain contingency, a cohort, maybe a couple who are saying, if David Coletto does well, it means Dave Trafford's not going to do well. There has to be some give and take in that. On the other hand, Dave Trafford might say, I can do well if I get David Coletto to do better. That raises all the boats. And to me, that becomes issue-driven as opposed to party-driven. Is that fair?
It is, I think, yeah. And what you're describing is this Financial Times article was citing some new research out of Harvard that showed, someone's mindset, right? Take anyone and how they think about the world, as you said, whether if I win, someone else loses, if they win, I lose. That's zero-sum thinking, right? That means there's only a finite amount of resources, and we're all fighting to get our share of it, because there's only so much of it to go around, versus a positive sum thinking mindset, which is, as you said, everybody benefits, right? When the economy grows, all boats kind of are lifted. And what this research shows is that the times in which you were raised or you grew up, or your formative years, and the broader economic situation has a big impact on that, right? So you now have, I think of my grandparents' generation who grew up during the World War II, Great Depression. They were very much of the zero-sum mindset, right? They were very frugal, and while they were very generous, and they saw, I think there was an optimism there because of what they got through, they still were very constrained in their thinking and saw that world through that lens. But the boomers and those that really had a really good run and economic growth during the 60s, 70s, even to some extent the 80s, which was a challenging year, challenging decade, were much more positive sum thinking. But what this article was noting was, if you think of some of the younger generations, particularly those, I would say, under 35, I'm an old young person, I guess, at 42, an old millennial. I remember the 90s being really good. Lots of growth, governments had surpluses, lots of opportunities. But if you're somebody who's in their 20s today, and you're seeing housing prices go through the roof, you're seeing the cost of living go through the roof, and you're not feeling that the opportunities are there, that's going to create this mindset that there's scarcity in the world, and therefore we've got to fight for everything. And it affects how we deal with our colleagues and our employers at the workplace, and I think it has a big effect on our politics. And so we are now, in a way, seeing, for example, and it's showing up in the data so interestingly, the Liberal Party right now is doing better among those over 60 than it is among those under 30, which is a complete flip. And if you think about the world today, if you're over 60 and you don't have a mortgage, and in fact, maybe you have some savings, a 5% interest rate is something that you haven't seen in a long time. And so every day you're feeling a little bit richer. Even if that cost of living is perhaps putting a little pressure on it, you're still feeling okay. Whereas if you are in your 20s or 30s and you're trying to save, and every day you feel like you've saved a little more money, scratched some savings to pay for a down payment, that house price has now gone up another 5%. You feel like you're just falling further and further behind. And so that creates this first intergenerational tension. It creates competition for things, and I think it's realigned in a way right now, anyways, our political behavior, and that's why I think the Conservatives are doing quite well, because they're talking about it in those terms, where the Liberals are still talking about this bigger pie that everybody can benefit from, and that is, I think, that's conflicting a lot with how people are feeling about their circumstances today.
I guess it comes down to acknowledging the circumstance, though, right? I mean, as opposed to feeling sorry for you, which there's a certain tendency in there. We have to. What about our children? What about the youth of the day? And to kind of give this paternalistic pat on the back and say we're here to help, as opposed to acknowledging that there's a crisis and coming up with sort of more or less solutions to the problem. Yeah. And it's a fine line in there. But and not to spark any kind of online grief here, but in the extreme, that's what's driving Donald Trump in the U.S. He has touched that particular nerve. He has acknowledged that Even though the stats say the economy's doing well, the stock market's doing this well, blah, 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 that the kitchen table issues in a very, specific, pixelated way are not being reflected. That economy is not being reflected in the personal lives, the personal business, the family life of so many, that there is a groundswell who, might not have otherwise voted, fill in the blank, but now we're going to, or at least we're considering it, because you acknowledge that I am here.
Yeah. And just to give you an example, the Prime Minister was interviewed on a competing podcast on another network last week, and this is front burner, and he was asked about the housing crisis, and the host really pushed him. Why haven't you done things? And you had all these years. You knew this problem was happening. Why are you waiting to the last minute? And he used this term, my heart breaks for people. And I listened to that and I thought, that's not the way to frame this. Mm-mm. That sounds like somebody up in the castle looking down on his or her subjects and saying, oh, my heart breaks for you, right? In fact, and so your point about acknowledging the problem, about admitting that this is the outcomes that we're experiencing today are not acceptable, is the way to go when you talk to people about it. And then show them, and here's what we're doing. And this is the problem with a government that's 8 years in power, is that at some point people say, you had your chance, you knew this was a problem, and you've done nothing about it. So I do think you're right on the mark in terms of the language we use. And this is true of somebody who leads a team at a workplace. It's about how you talk to your kids. It's about how you talk to a country that you're trying to lead. As times shift and people's mindset shift, you've got to change the way you communicate to them. And I don't think the federal government in particular has figured that out. And the leaders there are still talking to the country as if it's 2015, which was a very different mindset. It was one of hope and change and optimism, and we're moving forward. People now are feeling very defensive and are worried about whether that future is going to be brighter than the one that came before it.
And it doesn't kind of fall specifically on the feds or the Liberals, because let's face it, Doug Ford is in the same boat, politically speaking, to some degree, that the Prime Minister is in, because the Greenbelt that is one of the most epic political disasters that I have seen. I can't remember how bad it's been ever for a sitting government here in Ontario during the summer when there was no House sitting. Now the legislature's back. There's protests on the front lawn. And it's not just about the Greenbelt, but the Greenbelt disaster. And it can't be anything other than that. All of a sudden lights this fire around the Ford government. And his problem right now is that he's saying, we heard you, we listened to you. No, you really didn't. You spent 18 months ignoring it and supporting a bad plan, a bad process, and doubling down on the characters involved. To now say that you're listening, it only emphasized what you've just pointed out. No, you really weren't. You were just kind of patting me on the head and saying, this is what we have to do to build housing in the province. And more, whether you were a Liberal or an NDP or a Conservative, people are turning. So what the hell? Fuck off. That's not what's going on here.
Yeah. No, yeah, you lied to us.
Yeah.
And you admitted now you lied to us. And what else are you lying to us about? It just opens Pandora's box, and that's why trust and politics is so fragile, because we start, unfortunately, in a place where we don't trust political leaders for very good reason over the years in which they have done these kinds of things. And then you come out, and I think he needed to pivot away from it and do the flip-flop, but I don't think it's ultimately going to... He may get reelected down the road. He may not even run again. That's not the point. It's still too far away. But the damage has been done. And people now, including many who voted for the Tories, who for the longest time resisted, the negativity around this issue, and we're still telling us in polls, oh, we're going to still vote PC, even though we're not necessarily happy. Now I think they see through it and are wondering, well, what else? What other promise will you break, or have you broken? And now let's open that up and start exploring. So I agree, a complete disaster of a summer for both governments, federally and provincially here in Ontario. And in some ways, not always, because the circumstances particularly for the feds, are not entirely in their control, a lot of the blunders are completely their doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to get to the blunder that is the doing of the Speaker of the House, but just before we do, all of that conversation going on in Ottawa, it's no coincidence, I think, that the Alberta government chose this time to come out and say, hey, this would be a good time for us to opt out of CPP and run our own pension plan. And it speaks to that idea because we Albertans aren't getting our fair share of the money we're putting into the system. And it is the flip of the coin. I hear you. I see you. I know you want more value for the dollars you're investing, and I'm going to take care of you. As extreme and as crazy an idea as that might be, Premier Smith has actually touched a nerve here that I think is going to resonate with Albertans. Now, I don't know if you've done any research or polling on it.
We haven't done any polling yet. We will, and I think you're right. I think it is aligned with the thinking of Albertans generally. We know that, but I also think, Dave, like we talk about broken promises. She ran recently on an election which she said, we're not going to go down this path. And so I think she's opening herself up to the same trap that Doug Ford fell into, where a high profile idea like splitting Alberta out of the Canada pension plan, which comes with an immense amount of risk. Even if it sounds great, it sounds like we've got control, we can invest this money in Alberta, we contribute more than the rest of the country combined, all those kinds of things, still comes down to people feeling insecure about their retirement, and now you're going to go and make all these changes, right? One of the things that I've been saying to people is, as much as people tell us in our surveys they want change, they want a change in government, they don't want that much change, right? Like, we've lived through 3 years of crazy amounts of change. Pandemic, extreme weather, war in Europe, you name it. These perma-crisis era we live in right now means people actually just want stability. I don't want to read the news of politicians making one decision and then flipping it the next day, or fundamentally changing how systems work. So I actually think there's an inherent small c conservatism right now in a lot of people who say, let's just pause and catch our breath. But these politicians, I think, see that in a different way, and that signaling to them, let's change the whole system, when I don't know if that's what people are actually telling us.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think that their sense is this would be the time to bring it up, to light the fire. And even if that doesn't happen, Premier Smith can still blame, the elites in Ottawa for it not happening, or the courts, or whatever, and then that is in her playbook. All right, let's go back to the situation. While I was away, I get the notice in my feed, and Zelensky is going to be speaking to the Canadian Parliament. Big deal. Lots going on. Wow, this is significant again. And that just gets derailed because the Speaker of the House, before the whole thing happens, acknowledges someone sitting in the gallery who happened to be a 98-year-old who fought against the Russians in the Second World War. And for that, he decided that there was some worthiness of him being there. And it didn't take very long. I'm thinking minutes, if not seconds, for most people to do the historic math and say, if they were fighting the Russians, he was fighting for the Nazis. And there's no way around that, no matter who this guy was, what the backstory might have been, that this is now, and it popped up in the BBC News feed while I was away, so it's being acknowledged internationally as an embarrassment for this government. Oddly enough, it's not one of the Trudeau government's doing.
Yeah, it's a complete, utter disaster of a decision. I had this amazing privilege to go and see Zelensky in Toronto actually last Friday at the event they did at the Fort York Armory, and that was such an emotionally, it's just a great experience. In that, seeing him in person and then hearing, it felt like Churchill trying to build support, to rally the Americans to come and join the war, right? It felt that urgency. And then to just derail any momentum that visit to Canada was trying to create, to build support for continuing to support Ukraine in its fight against Putin. I think is just so irresponsible in a way, right? And it just, first of all, is a lesson in these are big moments, and anyone involved in the decision has to really do your due diligence. It shows how generational, I'm sure, I don't know who was responsible in the speaker's office and who didn't really put two and two together. But there was a moment where every MP in that house stood up and cheered for this man, and moments later absolutely regretted, that capture of it on video and elsewhere. It's so bad, and I think it feeds Canadians' perception that we just are not taken seriously around the world. And here's another proof point, right? Here's another example of us being talked about in negative ways. We gave Zelensky this platform to make a call to action, which I think the day itself, other than this, went well. And now it's going to be completely forgotten. All the good things that happened that day because this one moment embarrassed him and us and everyone involved.
Yeah, well, and again, I think the idea that, to your point, where the reflexive response was stand up and cheer, and then how many? I haven't seen the video, but I wonder if Chrystia Freeland was among those who stood up, because she would kind of know better.
Everybody stood up.
So there's
right?
And
the problem. As of the time we're recording this, the speaker still hasn't resigned. I still find that also and remarkable. I don't know Anthony Rota. I've heard he's a very good man. He's been a longtime MP, but just recognize when that mistake is so significant that you are now a distraction. Mm-hmm. And every day that you get up, even being the Speaker of the House while this debate is going on and you're not reclusing yourself feels weird to me. Yeah. So there's just so much about this issue that I'm sure just driving people crazy. And I don't know if there's going to be political consequences for the Prime Minister or the government on this issue, but it's just distraction again from the things it wants to be talking about, which is not, whether the House of Commons recognized a known, not just a Nazi sympathizer, somebody who was in a division that, did horrible things to Jews and Polish people. So,
and again, if in the extreme, it would have to come to the House, expressing non-confidence in the Speaker. And you talk about distractions. Again, back to, are you listening? Hello, over here. These are the issues that we're faced with today. David Coletto is the chair and the CEO at Abacus Data. You should read his and subscribe to his newsletter, In Focus. Also does the podcast by that name. David, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Welcome back.
Yeah, David's his newsletter, by the way, is very insightful. So you might want to just check that out. It's called In Focus. All right, that will do it for us here. We're back in the saddle. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. I'm Dave Trafford. Remember, if you like what you hear, by all means, share the show through your social media. Tell a friend about it. If there's somebody that you think is interested in the stuff we're talking about here, by all means. If you've got some thoughts on the local media in your area and how we might be able to help you with some of that, by all means, or reach out to us at hello@storystudionetwork.com. And, we'll be back tomorrow, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the state of local media, particularly in some of the small and medium-sized markets right across the country, particularly here in Ontario. All right, that's Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.